My name is Dennis Nevelink. I'm a research analyst here at Lazard covering consumer staples sector. The topic of today's Insights call is water scarcity risk. I'll walk you through why water scarcity is a material risk to consider and how I analyze this risk and how I incorporate it into my fundamental analysis. So we established a unique framework for ESG consideration in our research globally called materiality mapping. The idea is that each industry has several underlying ESG risk factors that impact the long-term value of the company. We debated most material issues for each sector globally and developed frameworks that included quantitative and qualitative metrics. We use these frameworks in our fundamental analysis. One of the important learnings from this exercise was that ESG materiality is really contextual. What is material to one company may be completely different for another company, based on sector, region, or product and operational choice. I'm hoping to bring this to life today with an overview of my analysis on the global beverage industry and how I use CDP, WRI, and other water-related data in my analysis. As you can see, this map from World Resources Institute, WRI, ranks every country by water risk on a 0 to 5 scale. WRI uses physical factors as well as regulatory and reputational factors. And the framework creates a score and a ranking for all major countries. As you can see in the map, there are a number of regions in the world that are seen as high risk. Areas in developed markets, if you look at the US, for example, include California and Texas with higher water risk scores. In Europe, there's Southern Europe with a very elevated risk, and there's Australia with an elevated water risk score. So water risk is not only an emerging market issue, it is also a concern in developed markets. So what is the actual impact from this on investments in beverage companies? As you can see on this chart, consumer staples companies, in particular beverage companies, have very high margins and returns. It is my job as an analyst to see if these returns and margins are actually sustainable over time. Effective water management and exposure to water risk and the analysis surrounding that is really a key part of this assessment as it impacts the cost structure and the top line of these beverage companies. On the top line, beverage companies rely on consistent availability of water. The companies need to have a good relationship with local governments and communities, and they really have to have a license to operate. There are a number of examples out there today where companies' operations were negatively impacted. This is especially true in water-scarce areas, where consumers and other water-dependent industries have trouble accessing water. That sometimes can really lead to consumer boycotts and even product bans. It impacts the top line in the short to medium term and potentially brand equity over the long term. Today's consumer cares about sustainability and how a product is manufactured. Over 70%, we found in a survey, of Generation Z consumers are shopping for brands that help them to make a difference. Effective water management can maintain and improve a company's brand equity and potentially lead to market share gains over time. From a cost perspective, water is actually pretty inexpensive today, and as a percentage of cost of goods sold, it's usually less than 5% for most beverage companies. This, however, could change pretty quickly as governments increase the cost of this access. We've already seen some examples of that in the recent past. So with the impact on revenues and costs very material, I believe that effective water management is a long-term competitive advantage. I then look at the data that is available and identify two key metrics to assess water management and exposure to water risk. The first one is water stress exposure. For this analysis, I used the World Resources Institute, WRI Aqueduct platform, which is the map that I used at the beginning of the presentation. I estimated company-specific exposures to water risk. I used the country score from WRI, which was at range from 0 to 5, and weighted it by each beverage company's country and manufacturing exposure in order to calculate a weighted score. As you can see in the chart below, the water stress exposure ranges widely across beverage companies. It is interesting that a number of developed market beverage companies actually have the highest water stress. You can see that 4 out of the 5 most exposed companies actually operate in developed markets. I then went one step further in the analysis and compared water stress exposure to each company's profitability. The idea is that a low profitability level coupled with that high water stress exposure creates the highest investment risk. Companies with higher margins, on the other hand, have a more meaningful buffer to manage potentially higher costs from water in the future. What I found is that a number of emerging market beer companies are vulnerable as they have low operating margins and high exposure to areas with elevated water stress levels. More surprisingly so, some of the soft drink companies in Western Europe and Australia are also facing elevated water risk. The next ratio is water intensity, sometimes also called water usage or water efficiency ratio. It is defined as how many liters of water are used in the production process of 1 liter of a finished beverage product. Most public companies report this data, and there are also some resources that I found for private companies to do further analysis. The key takeaways here are that the subsectors for beverages are very, very different. So in green, as you can see on the slide, we have spirits companies. In blue, we have beer companies. And in red, we have soft drink companies. You can see that there are very different ratios, and that is mainly due to their production process. It is highly important, therefore, to compare the companies on water metrics within their subsector. Even within each subsector, you can see it's still a very big difference between the best and worst operators. I also found that the facility size usually drives a big difference in water efficiency. This is driven by the process, including the length of the production run, the frequency of product changeovers, and the level of automation. This also further supports the idea that scale really matters when it comes to sustainability metrics. Many in the market call it shrinking scale benefits in the consumer staples industry, but if you think about it, sustainability metrics actually usually benefit from scale, especially when it comes to water. One recent example is that there was a really largest state-of-the-art manufacturing plant that was just recently opened in the soft drink industry, and it has sustainability at its core. It's using rainwater for cooling, it has 100% renewable resources that are being used. And what's important there is the water intensity ratio of this plant is close to 1.3, really the lowest that I've seen across beverages. So scale really matters. Beverage companies use a significant amount of water, as we have established, directly in the production process. They use the water indirectly in the supply chain, as they are a major buyer of water-intensive agricultural commodities as well. So corn and sugar need a lot of water, and there needs to be a focus on the supply chain as well. So there is an immediate focus on this improvement of direct water consumption, but there also needs to be really a strategy in place to help improve the overall supply chain. A number of companies have started to address that water stress at the upstream stage, and they're working directly with growers, and they're implementing water-efficient agricultural practices with a goal to improve really the water efficiency in key growing regions. And here, CDP's water questionnaire show us if a company is thinking of water management more holistically. As you can see in the table below, there are major differences between the companies. Furthermore, water replenishment programs are one of the tools that companies have to improve water availability in the community. We have found that leaders in the beverage space are generating replenishment ratios of over 100%, and these projects can range from restoring creeks and dams to broadly improving water access. Other companies are constructing water recycling plants close to their manufacturing plants and breweries, which really materially improves the average water consumption of these plants and reduces the water intensity ratio. Now let's look at the soft drink subsector. On water stress exposure, the soft drink sector scores as medium to high risk with a score above 2, with that range of 0 to 5. We found that companies with exposure to Spain and Australia have particularly vulnerable water risk, vulnerable to water risk. On water intensity, companies have been able to improve their water intensity over the last 5 to 7 years. I think it's really great to see that you see the overall industry improve water intensity over time. A lot of it has to do with best practices within facilities. There are many ways to improve water intensity within the plant, ranging from optimization of water usage in pumps, cleaning, cooling water, to water reuse practices. But there's still, despite all this best practice sharing, there's still significant differences between the companies, as one can see in the chart on the top right. So when we combine water stress exposure and water intensity analysis with disclosure practices, supply chain engagement, and the long-term company strategy, we are also able to identify leaders and laggards within the industry. If there are 3 things that I want to leave with you today, one, ESG materiality is really contextual. It is important to identify the key issues within each industry. So hopefully I was able to show you that our ESG analysis includes industry-specific ratios as well as alternative data sources. 2, in In global beverages, I believe that effective water management can provide a significant competitive advantage. Analysis shows where high margins and returns are vulnerable. Operational improvements can reduce this vulnerability. Scale matters for water efficiency. Supply chain must be part of the equation, and companies must consider all water stakeholders. 3. ESG analysis generates a different type of dialogue and engagement with companies' management teams. This is extracting new insights, perspectives, and data. Thank you for your time.